Ukrainian parliament recognized the Kuril Islands as Japanese territory. Chairman of the Ukrainian parliament said Crimea is Ukraine and the Kuril Islands are Japan. The Ukrainian President Zelensky told media that the Kuril Islands are under the Russian occupation and the world must liberate it as soon as possible. The decision on the Habomang and Shikotan Islands followed a debate in the parliament of Ukraine, including through recent widely condemned referendums. A statement by Ukraine's parliament also called on the international community to take all possible measures to legally formalize the status of the islands, known in Japanese as the Northern Territories. Ruslan Stefanchuk, chairman of the Ukrainian parliament, said Crimea is Ukraine and the Kuril Islands are Japan. Territories stolen by Russia around the world must be returned. 287 Ukrainian deputies supported the resolution. Also, the parliament urged the international community to continue taking measures on the treaty status of the Northern Territories of Japan. When the war of Russia against Ukraine started in 2014, Japan was the only Asian country to have imposed sanctions on Russia. As a reaction to the large-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Japan introduced sanctions against Russia again. Several other Asian countries showed their solidarity this time and did it too. Moreover, Japan has been supporting Ukraine with humanitarian financial aid and military supplies. Such support of any country in conflict is not typical for Japan. Its anti-Russian stance refers to the Kuril Islands issue, as Japan officially claimed these Japanese territories to have been illegally occupied by Russia. In its turn, Russia refused to continue long-running negotiations on the issue. The Ukrainian President Zelensky said, Ukraine confirmed its respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Japan, including its northern territories, which are still under Russian occupation. Today I signed the relevant decree. There is a corresponding statement of the Parliament of Ukraine, and we call on everyone in the world to make similar decisions. Russia said it was withdrawing from negotiations with Japan aimed at signing a formal World War II peace treaty due to Tokyo's tough stance against Moscow's invasion of Ukraine. Japan reacted angrily after Russia withdrew from peace treaty talks with Japan and froze joint economic projects related to the disputed Kuril Islands because of sanctions imposed by Tokyo. The Russian Foreign Ministry said the Russian side, in the current conditions, does not intend to continue talks with Japan on the peace treaty. Russia and Japan have still not formally ended Second World War hostilities because of the standoff over islands just off Japan's northernmost island of Hokkaido. Russian officials said, in the light of the outspokenly unfriendly nature of Japan's unilateral restrictions on Russia over the situation in Ukraine, the following measures are to be taken. In the current situation, the Russian side has no intention of continuing peace treaty talks with Japan, for it is impossible to discuss the signing of a fundamental treaty in bilateral relations with a country that takes an outspokenly unfriendly stance and tries to cause harm to the interest of our country. After the beginning of the war, pallets loaded onto the Japanese Self-Defense Force cargo aircraft contained bulletproof vests, helmets, and other non-lethal military equipment. Much different from the shoulder-fired missiles, drones, and other weapons many Western countries have sent to Ukrainians fighting Russia's invasion. Japan's decision to ship military equipment to Ukraine still marked a major step for Tokyo, whose pacifist constitution has for decades kept the country out of foreign military conflicts. Japan's defense ministry tweeted that this kind of mission is the first case for us, but we will do our utmost to swiftly deliver the equipment to Ukraine. Although Japanese officials say they had no plans to send weapons to Ukraine, Japan has been on the front lines of a Western-led effort to pressure Russia using diplomatic and economic means. Japan has imposed sanctions on Russian oligarchs, frozen assets of Russian banks, and this war status revoked Russia's most favored nation trade status. It has also sent $100 million in emergency humanitarian aid to Ukraine and smoothed the path to accept Ukrainians fleeing the fighting. This is a notable move in a country long reluctant to accept overseas refugees. The moves not only underscore Japan's broader shift toward a more assertive foreign policy, but they also show Tokyo has become bolder in aligning with the West and standing up for principles that underpin the existing US-led international order. In the first days of the invasion, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida acted quickly to frame the Ukraine crisis as a global issue. He said, "This is a very serious situation which doesn't just affect Europe, but also Asia and the whole world order. and the Japanese public seems to be in lockstep with his views. In a country typically more focused on domestic issues, the war is dominating news coverage. Thousands of anti-war protesters have taken to the streets of cities nationwide, and a recent poll shows that over 80% of the 1,063 people surveyed support Japan's economic sanctions against Russia. Aurelia George Mulkin says, Japan now surely realizes that trying to secure the return of the northern territories from Russia is a fruitless quest and acts accordingly. Never while Vladimir Putin is in power will Japan be able to achieve its decades-long ambition to secure the return of the southernmost Kuril Islands, which were formerly part of Hokkaido Prefecture. As the Russian military invasion of Ukraine has again illustrated so brutally, Putin is an imperialist bent on acquiring territory, not negotiating it away. The Kishida administration initially followed existing Japanese government policy by demonstrating preparedness to continue exchanges with Russian leaders on the return of the northern territories. After the first signs of rapprochement in 2016 under former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's leadership, warming relations began in earnest in 2018 and accelerated in 2019. At that time, it was agreed that bilateral negotiations on the islands should be based on the 1956 Japan-Soviet Joint Declaration. This document was quite explicit in its referral to the transfer of what was formerly Hokkaido Prefecture's Shikotan Island and the Habome Islets back to Japan, after the conclusion of a peace treaty between the two countries. Even Putin himself had demonstrated a willingness to seek an early conclusion of a peace treaty by returning these islands, has officially recognized the validity of the 1956 declaration. However, what looked like a possible breakthrough in 2019 resulting from Japan's acceptance of the two-island approach, abandoning Japan's claim to Kunashiri and Etorofu Islands in the southern Kurils, and accepting the return of only Shikotan and the Habome Islets, was simply Putin's first step in a merry dance, on which he has led the Japanese government ever since. This has delivered nothing for Japan, despite new concessions associated with Shinzo Abe's economic cooperation diplomacy, which reversed Japan's long-standing position that economic and political relations could not be improved significantly until the northern territories were returned to Japan. Other parallels with the Ukraine issue are also striking insofar as Russia treated the islands as a bargaining chip in trying to influence Japan's security relationship with the United States. Putin's extreme reluctance to cede any of the northern territories back to Japan has been justified in terms of his fear that Japan would allow the United States to build military bases there, including the deployment of a U.S. missile defense system, after the conclusion of a peace treaty. This is despite Japanese and U.S. government denials of any such intentions. Putin has also raised the general issue of the U.S. military stationed in Japanese territory, including Okinawa, in the negotiations, as well as setting the impossible condition that Japan had first to withdraw from the alliance in order to conclude a peace treaty with Russia. Matsumoto Koichiro from the Japanese Prime Minister's office said, "Support for Ukraine is quite natural since Japan is one of the biggest beneficiaries of global peace and stability. We attach great importance to universal values such as democracy, rule of law, and human rights, including freedom of expression. We know from our experience that when people stop fighting for these values, we'll be giving chances and spaces to authoritarian regimes. As the people in Ukraine are fighting for these values that shape our society, supporting them in any way we can is the only way."